Hello, this is Dwight Mutonono, also known as Mnyaradzi, also known as Mutos, and welcome to the Connection Desk. Now, we are continuing our series, this time on this. It is a 4-part series that we are doing, a quick one, which is on the book, or not on the book, but on the ministry and death of the apostles. We've been doing the book of Acts, and we are at Acts chapter 12. In Acts chapter 12, we see that James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, is killed by Herod, and he's the first one to be martyred. And we thought it would be good to take a break at this point and look at the other apostles and what happened to them. So James was the first to be martyred, and we want to look at the other apostles and how it is that they died and what their ministry was. And in the first video that I've done in this series, we talk about how these things are measured, because the data is not all from the Bible. It's historical material and there's historical evidence, and there are varying levels of confidence that historians have about the data that, the historical data that is used to talk about the apostles and what happened to them. So we're looking at that, and then we'll also look at, we'll talk about the quality of data that is used for us to be able to come up with the conclusions that are made. So how strongly we can hold to the positions that we talk about. Remember, as I said, it's not from the Bible, and many of the stories are actually maybe 100, 200, even 300 years after the event. So some of especially as you go further away from the actual eyewitness stories, the historical data becomes more and more questionable and needs to be looked at more thoroughly. And I mentioned in the first session that there are some other, again, tendencies to go legend and to add sometimes even fictitious elements into the thing. So that's why the evidence needs to be looked at very carefully. So Peter is the first one that we are looking at. Peter is mentioned in the New Testament more than any other apostle, including Paul. And all 4 Gospels list him among the first to be called by Jesus to be one of his followers. He was in the inner circle of Jesus. James and John were the other two, Peter, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And then we also see that he was clearly the leader of the group. He was the spokesman most of the time. And even at the beginning of the book of Acts, he is the one who stands and addresses the crowd. So we see him very prominent in that first part of the book of Acts, but then he becomes less prominent as the book progresses and Paul comes into more and more the frame of it. But at some point, it's clear that Peter moved and resided in Rome. 1 Peter 5 verse 13 provides the earliest evidence of that indirect evidence for Peter's stay in Rome. Why we say indirect? Because he doesn't directly say he's actually in Rome, but these words are what he says. She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. So it's a little bit of a cryptic communication there. But all recent scholars recognize that Babylon that is being referred to here, when he says she who is at Babylon, he's talking about the church that is in Rome. And refers to the church from which he was writing. And the Old Testament city of Babylon was in ruins. So it obviously is not the Old Testament city of Babylon that is being talked about here. So rather it was a relatively common cryptic name for Rome. You find that again in the book of Revelation. Babylon and Babylon is actually referring to Rome when you read the book of Revelation. So it was a cryptic name, and like the Hebrews exiled in Babylon of the Old Testament, Christians in Rome felt themselves exiles in a foreign land a sinful city that oppressed the people of God. So that's why they called it Babylon. And the second line of indirect evidence is the likelihood that Mark wrote his gospel based on Peter's testimony while in Rome. So Mark was Peter's interpreter. That's Papias is one of the people that, one of the early fathers who says that, and he wrote down everything that Peter remembered. And internal evidence also suggests or indicates that Mark was written in Rome. There are Latin words, Latin expressions, and all sorts of explanations that indicate that this is someone who is writing from Rome. And in 2 Timothy 4:11, get Mark and bring him with you, as well as 1 Peter 5:3, where Mark sends his greeting. It places him in Rome at that time. So most likely with Peter, and this is a secondary evidence. The earliest reference to the death of Peter is found in the book of John, chapter 21, verse 18 to 19. Truly, truly, I say to you, this is the Lord speaking. When you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. So that's the other indication, or one of the earliest indications of how he would die. Because even there in the book of John, in brackets, he comments and says, this is said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And then after saying that to him, he said, follow me. So we see that in the book of John, there's a clear indication that the words that the Lord used there were interpreted to mean, or to mean that the Lord was talking about how Peter was going to die. There's a traditional view that Peter was crucified during the reign of Nero. After looking at all the data, this is the conclusion that we see Sean McDowell, whose document we are using. It's been analyzed, the data has been analyzed, and this is the conclusion. Number one, the martyrdom of Peter is the highest possible probability from the data. So you gave it out of a scale of 1 to 10, it's given 9 to 10. It's right at the top level. The crucifixion of Peter, very probably true, is given an 8 to 9 in that scale. Peter was in Rome, very probably true, 8 to 9 in that scale. Martyrdom during the time of Nero, more probable than not. Again, that's a 7 to 8 range. This is the historical data. So was Peter martyred? Yes. Was there crucifixion? The story of him being crucified and talking about him wanting to be crucified upside down, very probably true. Was he in Rome? Very probably true. And during the time of Nero, there's not enough evidence to say to give it the highest possible probability, but it's more probable than not. So we end up, that's Peter. We go to Paul. Paul is arguably the premier figure at the beginning of Christianity, and his influence has been felt so vast that some have just suggested that he might be better called the founder of Christianity. Looking at the data and the letters and the way that he developed Christian doctrine, that's some of the arguments that people have made. But he, of course, was not one of the 12. But we want to look at him in this category. That's why we're looking at him in this category. In Philippians, he wrote, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee. This is Philippians chapter 3 from verse 4 to 5. And while Paul spent his earliest years in a thoroughly Hellenistic city, Tarsus, he was in this city called Tarsus in the diaspora. He was clearly shaped by his family and synagogue with the utmost devotion to the Jewish faith. So though he was not in Jerusalem or in Israel, he had very strong Jewish influence. And the traditional view is that Paul was beheaded in Rome around AD 62 to 68 during the latter part of the reign of Nero. Scholars disagree significantly over the validity of that tradition, but the only way to properly evaluate that view is to consider the merits of each individual piece of evidence. And, that's what McDowell wrote. And he looked at the different pieces of evidence. The Bible, of course, does not state that the death of Paul directly. And where we do get a bit of an idea of that he's dying and he's in Rome. In 2 Timothy, there was, in chapter 4, there's the urgency and the idea, or the fact that he's in Rome, says, and he seems to be referring to his death, which was soon coming, in 2 Timothy 4, where he says, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. And this passage is regarded as one of the most explicit references in the New Testament to Paul's martyrdom, which was coming. And he expected his imprisonment to end in death, and he recognizes he has stayed faithful to his ministry, which is coming to an end. So he was anticipating that he was going to die. Tertullian became the first church father to state that Nero had Paul beheaded in Rome. So Tertullian, remember I mentioned last that Tertullian was born in 160 AD, and so he would have been writing maybe 180 or a bit later than that, because 180 would be 20. But so towards the end of that first of the 2nd century, we find Tertullian writing. So he was born in Carthage in 160, and that would mean that there is some living memory of Paul that was passed on to him. So he would not have seen Paul, but maybe some older people would have been able to pass on some of the stories. It was maybe, more than 100 years, so it was more or less 100 years after Paul's death, but then there could be some living memory from the 1st century of some of these stories. And Tertullian reports that Paul was a Roman citizen and links his death to the time of Nero. So he was so confident in his claims that he says the archives of the empire can be examined to see those details. So if they want those records, then Tertullian would really just be that statement. I mean, it would undermine his credibility. So it would be very difficult for him to write something like that and his credibility to remain. So the traditional view that Paul was beheaded during the reign of Nero between AD 64 to 67 was examined, and these were the 4 conclusions that they came up with. Paul was in Rome, the highest probable possibility, 9 to 10. The martyrdom of Paul, 9 to 10. Martyrdom during the reign of Nero, very probably true, 8 to 9. And the beheading of Paul, likely 7 to 8. That is based on the historical data that they have. Okay. James, the brother of Jesus, is the next one. And until recent times, James, the brother of Jesus, was a largely forgotten figure in early Christianity. So, but if you read the New Testament, you can, cursory, if you just read it, over and not too deeply, you would see Peter, Paul, Mary, John, and other characters as more prominent or more important. But the past few years, scholars have realized that James, the brother of Jesus, took on a big role because even as we look at the first Acts chapter 12 towards the end, we see that Peter says to the brethren who are in Mary's house, tell James that this is what has happened, and then he disappears. Okay, so he doesn't stick around in Jerusalem. He just says, tell James of what has happened, and then he goes. And of course, it's referring to James, this one. So it seems like at that point already, James was now leading the church. And we see him in the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. We'll see him taking a prominent role. And he was the chair of that meeting. And he's never labeled the just in scripture, but that is what is described as in the book of, in other traditional or historical books that talk about the history of the early church. Jewish historian Josephus, he said that he provides the earliest account, and he's a contemporary, he's living during that time, and he says, in the wider context, there's a discussion about the difficulties Rome was facing with its residents. So the wider context of what Josephus was writing about, there was this thing happening, problems happening in Jerusalem. It led to the invasion and destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And the passage regarding James allows the dating around AD 62. And Josephus places his death between Roman procurators Festus and Albinus. So that will be around AD 62. And upon the death of Festus, Nero appointed Albinus. Okay, this is other detail. I don't think I need to get too much into it. I'll just say it's AD 62 for our purposes. And the second Christian account, so it talks about how he was stoned to death. Okay. But then there are other accounts that talk about him being thrown from the temple and beaten to death. So Josephus talks about being stoned to death. Other accounts talk about being thrown from the temple and beaten to death. So there are variations that come a bit later than Josephus. And what do we make of that? So the traditional view that James was martyred in Jerusalem was carefully examined. And on the close examination of the evidence, there was this indication: James was executed by stoning, highest possible probability. He died as a Christian martyr, very probably true, 8 to 9. And he was thrown from a high structure at the temple, more probable than not. They're giving that one a 7 to 8. So that gives you an idea of some of the way that we're going to be looking at this material. We will stop at this point, and we will continue to look at the other apostles. We're going to get into John, the brother of James, and then we'll get into James himself and so on in the next session. So God bless you. We are continuing with this series, and we want to finish this in the next 2 sessions. Thank you very much.